So we're going to begin our next talk. As a strategic talent consultant and leadership coach, Susan McKeone brings 30 years of experience in developing highly talented individuals to prepare for senior leadership roles and has been recognized by clients as having made significant impact through her engagements. With a focus on the interplay between individual leaders, teams, organizations, and culture, Susan learns and adapts to the context and environment in which her clients operate. In most cases, Susan's engagements are long-term strategic relationships that have stood the test of time, as judged by successful leader successions and transitions, and in the dynamic leadership performance of clients who build strong collaborative cultures. Susan is recognized as a key executive strategist, as well as a preferred HR partner. Her engaging and direct style is both pragmatic and supportive. It's an honor to have her here. Susan, welcome to Concentric.
Thanks, Seth. I'm glad to be here. So what we're going to be talking about today is sort of a view into corporate cultures and how they might be impacted by the way an organization is organized, the organizing model, the structure of the organization. So this way of looking at it is kind of like a cultural anthropologist, if you will. So looking at how different aspects of culture are impacted by the way the organization is structured. We can take a look at the first slide, Seth. The next slide. Yep. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take some key elements of how an anthropologist might actually look at culture, whether the culture, is Samoans or, GE. Anthropologists are going to look at certain kinds of elements in being able to interpret the culture through the behaviors of the people in the culture. Of course, anthropologists would be looking at all kinds of elements. We're going to look at 4 today that are particularly relevant to corporate life. So, sort of obviously the first one is the power. Where does power reside? Oftentimes that might be at the top, but in other kinds of organizing models, it might be somewhere else. Communication, which obviously is really important to any kind of business, any kind of, the work of the organization. Leaders in the organization as well as employees need to be able to communicate goals, direction, feedback. So how that communication is done and received, given and received, would be part of that element that we'd be looking at. Learning is a really important element of any culture and shows up from day one. So as an individual joins an organization, whether that's a child to a family or a tribe or a new employee in a company, there's a process that would be part of the culture in acclimating that person, having them learn what they need to learn to be successful in that organization. And then obviously achievement goals, what's kind of defined as achievement in the organization, what's defined as success, how are people recognized and rewarded according to achieving those goals. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these key elements of culture and overlay them on 2 different organizing models in companies. So let's look at those next. So we're going to look at the obvious one when you're talking about primarily corporate cultures, and that's a hierarchy. Most people would tend to think that that's how most organizations are organized, but actually there are many that are organized more around a network model. This would be particularly the case in more nonprofit kinds of organizations or industry membership kinds of organizations, but those networks also are really critical to corporations, even within a hierarchy. So that's kind of what we're going to look at here. So when we think about these two structures and you look at them, they're actually, in geometry terms, they are shapes. And if you remember back to geometry, shapes are built with lines, right? So if we look at the lines on the next slide, sort of the simple geometry behind these models, what we've got is that hierarchies are created more around vertical lines. So most of the work, the communication, of goals and so forth, tends to go up and down the organization. Whereas networks are built on more horizontal lines that go across. So now we're going to look at each of the two organizing models against along the lines of their alignment. So the first, everyone's pretty familiar with, a hierarchy. So as I said, what happens in a hierarchy is the action is going up and down. Often the goal of being a member in the culture, a goal of your career essentially would be to climb. The action in a hierarchy, because of the vertical alignment, is creating a ladder kind of way of thinking about how work gets done and what success is really. So work gets done by going up and down the ladder. Often a career's goal is to climb it. If information needs to be disseminated, it is often cascaded down from the top. The way that people learn is through competition to be able to climb the ladder, because as you can see, there's a pinnacle. So not everybody that's on the bottom will ever see the top. And so there needs to be competition in order to understand who has mastery in the organization. So again, mastery would be kind of beating out everybody else with your success and being able to climb the ladder. So let's look at the horizontal alignment on the network and see how very different it is. I mean, it feels different right away. The goal of the organization is more fluid and dynamic. The action creates a web. And so the action is fluid and dynamic in it. People's goals tend to be to reach out. Information is exchanged as opposed to cascaded. So every member in the network is involved in communication, in generating ideas, as opposed to competition. There tends to be more of a reward for partnership and collaboration. And interestingly, the mastery is not as much the purpose as influence. So in the more competitive hierarchy, where people are trying to climb the top and only certain ones get to the top, the real goal in a horizontal alignment is to have as much influence as you can, as many nodes that are connected into you, or as many people who might seek out information from you will have to do with the level of connection you have in the network, as opposed to in the hierarchy, it's more about how many people are underneath you, right? So sort of a yertle the turtle from Dr. Seuss kind of thing, right? That you've got, you're high up in the organization as opposed to the network. Power mostly comes from being in the center of things. If we could look at the next slide. Yeah. So some of you might be thinking to yourselves, is my organization a hierarchy or a network? Well, the organizational reality for most companies is that you go in and out of actions in your day, meetings in your day, tasks in your day, and you're moving in and out of these two organizing models. Sometimes you're in a meeting that's being run by your boss, and he or she is the person that's, sort of providing most of the direction and the information. But in other situations, you might go into a project team where perhaps there is a project leader, but they're more of the center of the activity of the team, as opposed to sort of having power over an organization. And so if we look at these different cultural dynamics, as I indicated before, if we look at power, communication, learning, and achievement side by side against these two kinds of models, you really understand how the behavior that you might have as a team member in either of these kinds of organizations, it's really beneficial to understand which organizing model you're in at the moment in order to be able to sort of decipher the right kind of the most successful behavior from you, as well as, sort of the right cultural influences. So for power in an organization, as I indicated, the power is obviously at the top. And being decisive and succeeding in achieving goals is what gets you to the top. Whereas in a network, obviously there are goals that need to be achieved, but the power is really being in the center of the network. And that's where you would have the most influence, because most of the nodes from the rest of the network will come into you. That doesn't necessarily mean when you're in the center of a network that you are the boss. It could be that you're the person who knows everybody. You're the person who has all the ideas. It may not be your ideas. It may be that you're the person, because you're so connected to everyone, you know the ideas of other people and who's doing what work and can be a connector. So you can see that the power in those two organizations is very, very different. Communication works the same way. Typically in a hierarchical organization, there's sort of a standard set of communication that needs to be cascaded. The alignment needs to happen by everyone getting the same message. So the message cascades from the top, and the goal is for everyone to understand what that message means at their level, but it's an aligned and consistent message. Whereas in a network, the goal is not to communicate up and down the hierarchy, obviously, but to reach out. And again, it's a much more fluid and dynamic set of communication going on. People are actively engaged. The message is actually changing. It's a much more ideal place for things like innovation and creativity to happen, because what the message is at any moment changes with whatever the latest thinking is. And that right there is one reason why often change in a hierarchical kind of organization is more difficult to maneuver, because it's not as dynamic. We talked a little bit about learning. Learning in a hierarchy, as I said, is more about competition for mastery. So you have essentially, sort of apprentice time when you have new people to the workforce, and they are learning to be masters. And there is a sense of competition against others who are at the same level for who is going to achieve that mastery. Whereas learning in a network is more about sharing experiences. There isn't really as much competition as much as wanting to share lessons, share perspective, share experiences, and everyone is kind of enriched by that. And then achievement for each of them looks very different in that overall the goal, at least in a career sense, the goal of achievement would be to acquire authority, which would then give you control. Whereas in a network, the symbol of achievement would be to be well connected, to know who's who, to know what ideas are flowing along the network, and to be able to really sort of capture them and make them happen. So that, I guess I did want to say in the beginning that where I'm coming from with all of this, as Seth indicated in the bio, is I've been doing work in corporate cultures for 30 years. And these are just sort of observations that I've made along that time span of understanding how, as networks have become more important in companies, in order to get products developed, in order to manage more geographic areas, larger geographic areas, those kinds of things. Just in managing groups of people and the work that they do. As I noticed that as networks were becoming more important in the work of the company, people were still trying to behave in those networks as though they existed in the hierarchy. If we can go to the next slide, Seth. So again, this is your organizational reality. You don't really live in a hierarchy, and you don't really live in a network all day long. For the most part, most of us wouldn't. Most of us go in and out of those two kinds of organizing schemes. And so it's really helpful to understand which scheme you're in order to be able to be most effective, behave most effectively for performance in those different kinds of structures. So that's what I had for you today, and I would love it if someone had some comments or questions for me.
And Sue, let me say thank you for presenting this really interesting information, really important stuff, and I think it does have an awful lot of potential importance for folks who are working in a lot of different fields, but certainly in the field of UX, where I understand relationships and organizational structures can get complicated. So
yeah.
At the moment, I'm not seeing questions. If folks do have questions that they would like to have Sue respond to, feel free to either put them in the chat or into the Q&A box. Be more than happy to give her an opportunity to answer anything that you might want to know.
Or just hear your thoughts if you have any.
Absolutely.
I do want to say too that Seth, they'll have my slide deck available.
Oh, that's great. Yep, yeah, we can make sure that that is the case if you'd like.
Okay, because I just wanted to mention too that on the last slide I've provided 3 references to 3 TED Talks that I just thought people might find really interesting that are
let's pop those up.
Yeah, so these are 3 of my favorite TED Talks. I don't know who else likes TED Talks, but it's a great way to, in 18 minutes, understand the theory behind some books. So the one is Nicholas Christakis, who is a social psychologist. I think he's still at Harvard. He is the person who is credited with starting a new social science called network science. And it's just really fascinating. He takes a look at all kinds of ways of identifying people in a network and seeing how certain clusters of people come together even when they don't know each other necessarily. An example that he gives in his TED Talk is around obesity. So when he's able to sort of map out these huge, almost become sort of mega organisms of networks, you can see where people who are obese tend to all cluster together in certain areas in the network, and people who are not cluster together, to the point where, you know, if your friend's friend is obese, then you will be more likely higher opportunity to be obese. So it's just really fascinating work about these social networks, and interesting after a pandemic, because they wind up looking very similar, I would imagine, to kind of the work that epidemiologists look at, and you know, the how a disease moves through a society is another way of looking at how ideas move through a society, and that's kind of the idea of what Christakis is talking about there. Where are good ideas come from? Steve Johnson, that's an excellent TED Talk, very interesting about exactly that, where good ideas come from. He's done a lot of work on innovation and puts a lot of myths to end in terms of, you know, basically one of the things that he says that's most important here is that the network that you're in absolutely influences your innovation. And that, you know, the myth of an individual sort of has these eureka moments where innovation just pops out of their head is not true. And they tend to come more from groups of people who are talking about the same ideas. And then the last one is just one, I'm not sure exactly how connected it is to the topic, but it's Drive, the Puzzle of Motivation by Dan Pink, one of my favorite authors in you know, sort of performance effectiveness, that kind of thing. And one of the things that he talks about there is, you know, how much motivation there is in either climbing the ladder or along the network that isn't necessarily related to what you might think, that it's not related to money. It's not related, you know, it's often related, one, to the mastery, purpose, and autonomy. Those are the three things that he talks about in being important in motivation. So those might be good references for you to look at as well.
Thank you, Sue. So I'm not seeing any questions, but I can throw one at you. So one of the things that I hear a fair amount from kind of the UX circles is, and not just UX, actually, frankly, from lots of folks that I know who are in the workforce, kind of complaints about how, whether folks are comfortable with it or not, hierarchies seem to kind of drive a lot of corporate culture. And even within kind of a small kind of mini hierarchy within a work group that someone's working in, if we kind of use the assumption that for a group to be able to really kind of get into some good creativity and innovative thinking, that it might be beneficial to have more of a kind of a network structure to a work group. If one finds oneself in the middle of a work group that paradoxically looks much more kind of top down and hierarchical, are there any things that people at the bottom can do in terms of trying to influence that structure, or is it simply a matter of, you know, get frustrated and walk away?
Well, when you're looking at actual networks that, you know, sort of a network structure that's being put in place by the hierarchy, essentially, I guess, right? So you have a hierarchy that just, you know, hierarchies are important in large organizations because it's how they organize, you know, very complex work. But often the hierarchy will put together these networks. To me, like a project team is a great example, a product development team, something along those lines, where you're taking people from different places in the organization and organizing them around a particular project. Like I said, there's often a project leader of some sort, but how that person sees their job is really at the heart of your question, Seth, right? So it is up to that leader. And again, this is kind of how I arrived at this kind of thinking, is observing this. Often I'm coaching those kinds of leaders, and they would come to me talking about how they communicated something, or how they were trying to get people to align around a goal, or those kinds of things. And I could see that where they were struggling was they knew that their title was leader, but they were trying to, the only model they really had of a leader was a boss in a hierarchy. And so in a project team, they don't have direct reports, but they are the leader of the team. And so often they try to go about their business as a leader, behaving as though these people, they have power over these other people in the team, and they don't. And so that doesn't usually end well. So if you're one of those people that the project leader is behaving in that way, I guess to me, the first thing to always lean into, but again, different cultures are more open to this, is just feedback, right? I mean, if you're a member of the team and this is the project lead and they're trying to lead you as if they have hierarchical power over you when in fact they don't, I think often the best way to get at that is to just directly, give them feedback. And that, of course, would be a whole nother presentation on how best to give that feedback. But yeah.
No, that's very helpful. I'm struck by the fact that there's a lot of kind of deep wisdom in some of this science, and I think if I'm following it correctly, and I think I am, it seems as though there's a lot of implications for how any of us as an employee of an organization kind of can, or maybe even should, interact with other people, that it should hopefully inform us in terms of how we do what we do and how we interact with those around us to kind of optimize the interactions that we're doing, the collaborations that we have.
Yes, yes. And the other point to make too is that for any who might hear this that are leaders themselves, maybe not the top of the pinnacle, but lead teams, paying attention to that behavior for yourself is doubly critical, because I always say sort of the tone of the leader sets the tone of the organization. So, even on the front line, the way that the leaders are behaving in these different organizations, and the way that they are optimizing their performance through their behavior is going to trickle down to the others.
Right. So
or across the network.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So certainly on behalf of, because I know we're going to be rolling up at the end of our time here in a second, on behalf of all the people that have worked for the people that you have coached along the way, I'm sure there's an awful lot of appreciation. It's tough working. I think it's safe to say it's tough to work for someone who doesn't get it, who's not super enlightened as to some of this, and who can make the lives of their subordinates extraordinarily difficult. And we've already had a couple presentations today about burnout, and there's a lot of reasons why people burn out, but this is certainly part of it, is working for an organization where there's a poor fit with the supervisor, with the C-suite folks who just aren't. They're not communicating effectively. They're not getting what's going on, and so it sort of stalls the whole organization. So,
and unfortunately, it can often be the overall culture.
Right.
That isn't. That isn't the fit. Yeah.
Right.
And there's really no changing that as an individual.
Right. So, I mean, I do know that is one of the frustrations that folks in UX often refer to, is the idea that they are trying to create a little kind of pocket of culture, of cultural change within an organization, of trying to be more sort of end user focused, more more interested in the quality of the final product over sort of some of those bottom line issues that oftentimes drive development work. So,
and pulling feedback, communication, information in from the customer into the organization, that's a critical network.
Absolutely. So hopefully there will be, I know we've had a couple of folks who stuck it out through the entirety of the presentation, which is great, and I'm hoping that they got something from it. And I suspect that we're going to have a decent number of people kind of, as this gets archived to YouTube, going through my talk this morning, your talk this afternoon, and the other two in our track. So again, I really wanted to say thank you for participating and taking the time to join us today. And
thank you, Seth.
It was great seeing you.
Great seeing you.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.